Okay, let's pick out. We left one thing on a piece of unfinished business in the midst of Shem Esocha. I think we did Shem Chinam and Shoel. And I assume that the different mitzvahs with what the Ram says in Mitzvah Kuf Yud Zayin, that even though they basically have a Shem B'Shutaf, they're all called Eichin, but have different dinim, that itself is conveyed different mitzvahs, and it may be a peculiar din in Shirana that different dinim are conveyed different mitzvahs. And here also, it's a these mitzvahs are basically dinim, and l'chayra, a person, it's only a shema aved that's an oisig mitzvah and part of a mitzvah, but stam shema, even though he's doing a mitzvah, but since it's shranda, there's no kiyum, there's nothing, so I assume there'll be no oisig mitzvah. And the Ram, and that's what the Ram we said goes out of his way to say that that the shloisha dinim li'abor shoymim, and since they have shloisha dinim, even though they're 4 different shoymim, therefore they can only be 3 mitzvahs. And since the din, that's what he says, the din of noisei socha and socha are the same, memela it's 1 mitzvah. I had problems defining, because the socha in the Torah is a poyo, and what the Ram is talking about is you're renting an object. So I'm not sure how you have shloisha shoymim. I mean, abor shoymim. I'm not sure exactly what the socha is, because if it's you're renting, as I mentioned last week, if you're renting the object, the Torah is not talking about that. And the person who's a hired hand, that's separate dinim shoymim on him, because he's hired to move something from place to place. You have to know what the cases are. But there's an assumption that a seicha is a poil. I mean, is a shoymim. We have to know why that's so. The Ram, in his discussion in Perek Aleph, talks about renting the chayfetz, which the Chai has nothing to do with the Torah is talking about. So we really had one problem, which he left off with, that there's a machshach, and the Ksais disagrees with him, but for whatever it's worth, in Siman Kuf Samach Tes, in Sefer Beis, the Mashach says, and that's the Ma'amok in the Sefer, that Shoim Aveda, who doesn't receive money for the Shmira, so he assumes we don't say by him, my diamina b'shah shoimim, shoim esocha lahochi yabilis as aga kihechi delitla in the tirusi sefer. The Gemara b'mitziyat tzadi beis b'beis. So we don't. The Ksais disagrees with him. So the Achonim go back and forth about whether he is a Shem Avedis Chayiv in this issue or not. But l'cheira, even if you don't say Shem Aveda, what I was wondering is Lamaisa a seicher, or a person who rents an object, you can't say Hochi Yovi Agat Fei, and it's a mafurish in Ramam over here that and that's the Gemara in Shavuos, and the Ram learns the Reisa Dikadin, and in the base of that, it's all 1 mitzvah instead of 2 mitzvahs. So you also can't say according to Marshach. Why should it be the same? So I think there are two approaches over here. First of all, you don't know that this svara of the Hochi Agat Nonota and the extra shmira that's required in the Mobatzi and Sadi Gimel is a deraisa digadin. We have no clue about that. There's no reason to assume that. And if it's not a deraisa, so b'chal, there's no kasha. And see, I don't understand how even the question starts, because the discussion is the Gemara assumes, the Mishnah is, that Seiche has no peculiar din of Shmira. He either is a Shem Echidom or Shem Esacha. So whichever category you put him in, that's the Gemara is playing. See, you can't really postulate it over here that see, the issue is, can you imagine that Seicha should be a separate din? See, if there would be an independent source of the din Shemira by Seicha, so you can imagine that it has separate din, a separate mitzvah. There's no independent source. All we're saying it's like this or like that. So if you say it's half like this or half like that, I'm not sure that itself would make it a separate mitzvah. Because the Torah doesn't, it's not that there's a separate din Torah by Seicha to make, the only way that Seicha could be a separate mitzvah if the Torah would give it separate din, which you don't find. So I'm not sure if you can find nuances between the two that would say Ein Shav, because we're either saying the Seich is like a Shem Esacha or a Shem Echinam. That's what I assume. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, here we get into a very interesting thing. I remember working at this many, many years ago. I said Shiur and Azov. Mitzvah Reish Mem Hey. Mitzvah Achomesh V'Arboim Umosayim. He HaTorah Shoreinu. So again, Horeinu is a Shrano. It's a mitzvah Sheina Muchletis. It's not a Tzivui Muchlat. It's basically religious law, which we're obligated to follow, and an implied command, because the Torah has religious law. The Torah expects you to observe it. And what's the mitzvah? Bedin mekach memka. So you understand yourself. You have two people. One person spends the whole day in mekach memka. The other person is not involved in business at the moment, every single moment back and forth and buy and sell. So would anyone in their right mind say that the person who's constantly involved in mekach memka has a bigger schar, a bigger olam haba than the other person? So this just illustrates that what the Minchas Chinuch says in Tavkuf Tzadiches, the way I understand the Minchas Chinuch, that mitzvahs which are shrana which religious law, like he calls Ta'im V'nitan, there's no kiyum in them. If there's no kiyum in them, so it's difficult for me to imagine that he's a bigger tzaddik because he does it more often. So this mitzvah, let's go on. The definition of Sharana, if you recall, we had in Mitzvas Tzadihei that when he's talking about Aforos the Dolim, that those religious laws which are recorded in the Torah, one is supposed to, I assume that's what I assume, one is supposed to act according to them, and they become mitzvahs, they become Sharana. So since it's recorded in the Torah, v'chisimko memkol amisecho, there is a mitzvah in Minyan HaMitzvos called memkol. Now, l'chayra, if there's a mitzvah memkol, I want to show you something. So let's say someone gives you a matana or yizechem in a hefker. Is the mitzvah, is that part of this mitzvah? Because the mitzvah is chisimku memkol amisecho l'chayra. It's the interactive between, it's the buying and selling between two fellow people. So the truth is, if you look at Hilchos Mechira, at the beginning of Hilchos Mechira in the Partei Mitzvos, it says, Din Mechel Memke in Hilchos Mechira. But if you look in Hilchos Chiyah Matana, in the Partei Mitzvos, there are no mitzvahs there. Inyan elu halachos, hilchos chiyuv matana. Inyan elu halachos, leda din zeiche min hafke, heich yikne or ma yikne. Bedin noise matana umekabel. Ve'eze matana chayzeres, ve'eze ena chayzeres. Ubia kol adinim elu, beprokim elu. But there's no mitzvah here. And you understand why yourself. Because the mitzvah is mechol memko, it's kisimko memko amisecho. It's only between two people. And there's no reason to assume that since the Torah formulated how you are cleaner by mechol memko, that they have the same parameters in matana and in schim and a heft. And that's the Ram says, Goitzeloima, Haponim or Adrochim, Asher Bom Yiskayim, Hamecher, Bein Hamoiche, Vakreina. So you're talking about Ben Hamoicha Vakreina. You're not talking about a Zeichem and a Hefker. It is possible we don't know that the schiyam and a heft is a deraisa. We don't know the schiyam matana is a deraisa. But whatever it is, since there are no psukim which talk about schiyam and a hefker, or how one gives someone a matana. That's separate psukim, but it's choshes or it's similar that it's kin chotze, it's like whatever. But we know nothing about it. So a male, it's not a minyan. It's not minyan mitzvahs. Even if we had a drosha, that's not enough. It has to be fuisha possible. In Torah Shabbat talking about the issue. Okay, now that we've talked around it, let's try to get to the point here. What is the mitzvah of Mekach Umemkar? What's the Torah trying to machadish? So let's understand a backdrop over here. Let's use Taisus as the backdrop. Taisus B'Cheres, Yud Chesem Beis, Diva Masru Aknuye, Aknuye, Komaknele, Mishum Chatzerot. So I'm reading a line in the Taisus. Vafilu b'lei kinyan kokoni, the goma u'mishabe. Since this Gemara das, you don't require kinyan. You see like that in Taisus Ksuvas, Kufala from an Aleph, the Maskal Liba, the Ben, the Eilis Moya, Eichi b'shtav b'shtav, b'chule b'chule. He says, we owe the Shaminim B'Yecha B'Azov, there's Matar Muetes, the Chabeo, Kona, Av B'Shlegi Liyodei, the Gomo Makne, Hochinami, V'Teich, Shetoach Litne B'Shtar, V'Chaygav the Gomo Umak. So, there is a possibility of interpreting Taisa. Maybe, I'm just, you have to investigate it, but it seems to say like that. That according to Taisus, you don't need a Maisakian at all, wherever there's Gemal Das. We have Kvega in Tshuva, in Simon Chav Zayin discusses it. The Chazon Ish quotes his father. That's their assumption that all you need is Gemal Das. What I want to suggest is the Rambam is learning that's kufa with the posuk is machadish, that you need a ma'aser kinyan. You need a kinyan, whether it's going to be a mos or it's going to be mashicha. That's a different issue. We need a kinyan. Need a kinyan. And maybe that's why the Rambam opens up Hilchos Mechira to say this is what Hilchos Mechira is coming to tell you. Because he opens up Hilchos Mechira is saying that Gemiras, that there's no kinyan without a Ma'aser kinyan. Listen to how he opens it up. Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph Beis HaMekach Eino nikne bedvorim, vafilu eido leim edim. Ketzad, eido leim edim. Ketzad bez bayis zeh ani moichel lecho, yain zeh ani moichel lecho, evet zeh ani moichel lecho, poska domim. It's very clear they want it. שמוכר זה ושלא כך זה. הרי זה לא כלום, כי לא היו ביניהם דבורים מעולם. Interesting, and I don't know why he does that here. So I'm not sure why he adds that line there. So that he's very clear about between two parties. There is kinyan. And that's what the mitzvah is all about. So it means that the Torah has said, Gozer Torah, and that's what the mitzvah say, Leish Mem Hey is all about, that the Chalas Kinyan is rak in peculiar ways, in Ponim or Drochim, that are Mavuah B'Kra. And this is Dere Mekel Memka. However, it's not only Tesis, they're clear list in the Rishonim. Agashbo Baba Kamo Kufbeis Amar Aleph V'yesh Leima and Agashbo Divya Masko Chod Yom Rababa V'yesh Leima D'Chol Shedaitoi Chrevel Lehen Harbe Goma B'Daito B'Akno U'Schia Liknois Rafil Afkia Midei Hektish. Also, the Ravid in Baba Kama Kupes and Beis, the Masama Mavo. There it says Mishon, but they claim it should be Shekona. Hatseva Zechalehen B'Machshavtoi B'Kavnosa. The Sefer Truma Shar Aleph Chelik Aleph is Hey. Also the Ashminon, the Sakat the Ramino. Kivish love shoyson v'lei zicha b'lein tahavamim. Ki im b'dibo b'vad shelochol l'shmon adayin kin nechosav havu v'nichnesu tachas shibud amal v'kamash modelo, because it's Gemilus das enough. That's what I assume. Whatever it is, the Rambam over here, whether you accept all this or not, what the Rambam over here is talking about, the Rambam over here is talking about the Rambam over here is talking about is you need derech kinyan. And that's what the whole mitzvah is about. The question is whether it's going to be Mashiach or going to be Mos. We'll see as we go on to the Rambam. Let's continue over here. And that's what he says. V'kvar lo churaya al eile haponim mi omroi The Kitzur is this pasuk is the side and the side. The Torah says a parsha in the Torah in Torah Shebiksav how you make kinyan between two parties. Then he goes on. He does something very strange. Omru dova hanikne. Dova nikna miyad liyad. Kloima hamashicha. Ukvais ames shedva Torah mos kainis. Ushamashicha metatlin he takonis chacham. So this is very odd. Why is the Rambam having polemics back and forth and mentioning Reish Lakish's din of Dova Nikrim Yad Liad, the Shmishicha, and the Rabbi Yochanan disagrees? What's the whole point of this? And what is the issue over here? Mama Metzia, a Mem Zayin on a base, Rabbi Yochanan, the Vatera Mos Kainis, with Imam Mashiach Kaina, Gezer Shem or whatever. The more goes back and forth what the Gezer Shem is all about and what the Shem is. Reish Lakish Omar, Mashiach Mufresh is Minater. My time at the Reish Lakish, Omakov is Simkomem Kol HaMitzvos. Economy on Misecha Dovadik Miyad Yad. Yechanoima Miyad Lemute Kalk. Less Leo Burn no. Reish Lakish Im came with them. When I go back, okay? However, when you look at the Gemara, one thing is absolutely clear. Because either you say Dvar Teira Mos Kainis or Mashiach Mufuresh Min HaTeira, it's clearly part of Teira Shebiksav. Dvar Teira or Mufuresh Min HaTeira. That's what it's all about. But then so it's clear that according to everyone, you have a mitzvah. But the only question you have to ask yourself, there's some semantics and polemics they're having about words. And what's the difference in nuance between Dvar Teira Mos Kainis and Mashiach Mufresh Min HaTeira? So l'cheira, I would tell you, Mashiach Mufresh Min HaTeira. It means the Pshuta Shamikol. The Torah says, Melkonim Yad Misecha. Dova Nikrim Yad Biyad. The Pshuta Shamikol talking Mashiach. He takes it. Melkonim Yad Misecha. How do you call Misecha? You take it and go Mashiach. So Rabbi Yochanan doesn't go like that. Rabbi Yochanan says that's not necessarily what the pasuk says. But on the other hand, you have to ask yourself, why are most kindness? See, we understand from the Gemara why Rabbi Yochanan just has a svara to be there. He says miyad is to motzi kalka or whatever other things the Gemara has. Okay, but the question is, how do you end up with kesef? Almost. And if you're going to say, so this is a very interesting point. So maybe say, but there was a say it, you don't have to see reference to it. Let's assume for a second that the most kindness, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is the Pirush Makubal. So I would tell you that we'd be in hot water. Because if you recall, I was medayik from the Rambam in Sadi. Hey, in Mitzvah Sefer the Dorim that the kosu is osakbo, that the Torah goes out of its way to talk about the issue. It could be, and that's what I wanted to postulate and suggest, that Shurana, religious law, is only a mitzvah min minyan only because Mefurish Torah Shebiksav. We have the luxury of Torah Shebiksav or Torah Shebal Peh in Amal, in mitzvah muchlates. You can have, for example, Uli Ovdoi, which is really talking about Stam Avodah, in Mitzvah Hay. But since the Matiki Ashmur said that Uli Ovdoi, Tefillah, so Mela, you have a mitzvah. But that's because of the tzimur. But Lu Yitzur, you had religious law, which there is a pasuk, but the pasuk doesn't tell you anything except through the Pirush Makubal. It's not clear at all that would be a mitzvah minyan mitzvahs. And in fact, I think I suggested once that Aseh the Ram doesn't count leaving the fourth ruach when you siege a city, because it's, even though Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, there's no clear tzibur. It's only a pirush b'kubal what you have to do. So maybe that's the reason to have a Medina mitzvah. The Ramban does count. So I would assume that you have to say that Rabbi Yochanan says that Dvar Torah most kindness, the most kilu from Torah Shebiksav. So what's the nuance between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that Rabbi Yochanan says Dvar Torah and Rabbi Yochanan is Mefurish? So what I want to suggest, I found in Talmid Rashba, in the beginning of Perek Hazov, Mem Daled and Aleph, Tivra Masruk Shem. V'oid she'oma kosuv be'inyan knias metaltel l'ekonomi arabisecho v'stam kniyos einoi ela b'kesef. So according to the Talmud of Rashba, that even according to Rabbi Yochanan, the source of the mitzvah is v'simku memkar v'secho. There's no doubt about it. The only machlekes is about the word miyad, whether the word miyad means Mashiach or doesn't mean Mashiach. And that's the Ram says that it doesn't mean Mashiach. So once it doesn't mean Mashiach, you know by negation that the Torah is talking about a kinyan and doesn't say what it is. So it means the Torah is talking about Stam Kinyan. And what Stam Kinyan moles. So once you negate Reish Lakish, you have the answer in. So that's what Ram does. He says, Amud va'adov nikum miyad, and that's mufreshes minater. Kloima ha'mashicha. But the kvais ames nisbare shedvar Torah mos konis, and that's not shot in the pasuk. That's not shot in the pasuk. Once we know that's not shot in the pasuk, so it's a stam kinyan, which is mos. Mashicha metatan lita konis racham. That's what I would suggest. Now, next point. He says over here, the Ram continues, Ushamashicha metaltlin hi tachonis hacham. V'chein hamesira v'agbo. So why is the Rambam putting all this together? So I thought the Rambam is telling you is that I can imagine according to Reish Lakish should be the opposite. That not only Mashiach metalton is deraisa, but Mesiu and Agbo. And if there's a takon of Mashiach, in the takon of Mashiach is still Agbo. Because Mashiach, Mesiu and Agbo is really one thing. And that's the Pashas, the Mishnah Torah, in Perek Gimel, in Hilchos Mechira, Halacha Aleph, Gimel, and Dalet, Echre Behemo, B'Shal Metalton, Niknim B'Mos Din Torah, Mishnosan Es Hamos Kona, Ve'en Echre Mehen Yochol Achzaboy, Ava Chacham Tiknu, Shel Yiknu Metalton, Ele Bahagbo, or Mashiach. You get the impression, Ele Bahagbo, Mashiach, it's one takona. Dov Shein Dakol Agbir. Bahagbo o Mashiach, but Dov Shein Dakol Agbir. B'chule. Asvino oil, B'Ef Shel Agbir, V'gam Mashiach Terech Godol, Ve'en Sheches, El L'Rabim, Lo Yitzyichu Mashiach, El Nikas Mesira. So it's all increments in how you do this Mashiach. V'chein kol kiyetz b'zeh. V'imama lo yamoicha b'shoich u'knei eno kleina asvino. Ad shim shecheno kula. V'yotzieno. Mikol mokoim. Mikol hamokoim. To be completely. Shehoyisa. Mikol hamokoim shehoyisa bo. Shehari hikvid hamoicha shelo yikne el b'shich. Nim says lomed shochech v'tat af mishinos kodon. Yochol achzbo v'chein hamoicha yochol achzbo ad sheikbir o yimshech Dov shein boy hagbo or yimsa hamoiche lokech dov shein dako lahamshich lagbir. Or mosh dov shein dako lagbir v'chui. So I would say the Ram is trying to say they're all the same. Hagbo, Meshicha, Mesira, it's all the same. However, we shouldn't disagree with the Rambam from two different angles. The Ramban from one angle and the Rashbam from a different angle. The Ramban says that according to everyone, Hagbo is a D'Rabbanan. And according to Rabbi Yechanan, it's ki'ilu, a logical extension of Mashiach. But it's an extension of the Rabbanan. That you don't need Mashiach Mamish. But it's enough with Agbo that's Amanas Nimshach. Kedusha Amban, Kedusha, Chofheim Beis, Divi Amascho, Beheim Agasa, V'efse Shoshona Mashiach, V'nei Shekulum, Kulon, Leitiknum, Ela Limshach. Excuse me, Kulon Leitiknu, Ela Machmes Mashiach. The man diomo economy and amisecho the dov and dikum yad yad ainu mishicha shagbo im eno moishcha levishustrei umachzir lemakoyma ein anikoyre bo miyan amisecho. Hagbo is not miyan amisecho even according to Reish Lakish. Said I miyan amisecho. Leman divi k'nei shaloyim. This is that's Balia. That's Rabbi Yechanan. Nami ika takona mishicha he. L'moishcha l'rishusay. Af b'shitik na'bo mishum shemishah shehigbio amanas limshach. Hagbo is amanas limshach. So basically, you cannot put Mashiach and Agbo in the same category. You have Mashiach, which according to Reish Lakish Deraisa, and you have Agbo, which is Rabban according to everyone, and it's somehow connected to Mashiach, but it's not Mashiach, it's Amanas Limshach, and the Rabban, that's also okay. And the Rashbam does just the opposite. That Agbo is a Deraisa, even according to Rabbi Yechon. Because Hagbo is like Chotzer. It has nothing to do with Mashiach B'chlal. The Rashbam says in Peivovom and Aleph B'Basra, B'Mashiach, Shemoishchon L'Rishusa, Hoy L'Rishus Yesh Lo Chelik Bo, Mo Simto, B'Chotzer Ashutfen, Chotz Kein B'Hagbo, D'Hagbo Kine B'Chol Mokel, U'B'Chol Dova, V'She'Biyeh Nichol L'Rishusay, Afilu B'Lo Mashiach. Kein nearly. So it seems to be, he says, the Meshibia Hinicha with Birshusa. It means that it's Chotzer. So it should be Kohen even called Rabbi. So it's, and here I'm just pointing out, the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvos is going out his way to say not like that, but to equate Mesilah and Agbo to Mashiach. However, you should ask yourself another question. The observation is true that the Rambam is equating them, but the simple question to ask is, what does it do with Minyan HaMitzvos? Why is the Rambam talking about it here? So I would tell you the following. The Rambam is making a point that the only kinyan of Metru Memka Midaraisa is Kesed, because there's no other pshat. Anything which you combine miyad liyad is not the pshat in the pasuk, like Rabbi Reish Lakish says, and you could have learned in that the same way Mashiach, Mesira, and Agbo, because also miyad liyad. That's what he seems to assume, Rambam. And the answer is it's none of them, but it's Tam Kinyan, which is Mos. Ubebeya Omru, what will come in Ein Testament Aleph, Keder shetiknu Mashiach b'lekuchen, kach tiknu Mashiach b'shem. Now, it is true that there might be a machlekes rishonim about what tiknu Mashiach b'shem is, and what is mechayev, what is not mechayev. But mechayev has nothing to do with us. Those that are interested, look at the Lechem Mishnah in Hilchos Schiras, Pei Beis Aloch Ches. However, what is important for us is that, again and again, it's clear that the Psak Halacha is not like Reish Lakish, but Rabbi Yochanan. Since it's Tiknu Mashiach, Tiknu B'lekuchen, it's only Drabot. That's what he's interested in pointing out. So once you knock out Reish Lakish, you made Rabbi Yochanan as an open field. The point is, as I said before, that it's not that you have to prove Rabbi Yochanan. Once you don't have Mashiach and flesh and Minatera, So in Mela, it's a stam kinyan, which is most. Now, Hine is boil choshe Yosef matzrichen mish hamashicha b'memkorim. It's not there's a pirush makubal or whatever it is. Mipnei shi takon kamo she's by mekorim, and this is again the proof that vater most kindness, and that's the mitzvah. The Rav always to point out the Ram Perek Tesla was Trumas Alach Yud. Your Li Shimocha Kohen Porosel Yisrael Loch Hadomim Afa Pi Shadayin Loi Moshach Alokeach Harize Osel Achilo Trumo. The Kohen can't feed his behemoth, which he sold with a kinyan mos, to the Israel, shedin teomos koines, Moshe's boy beluchos mechomemko. V'mocha Yisrael koin be shenosan adam loisochal betrumat shimosh. The Rav said the reason why sell I the Rabbanim besake in Beshicha, so the Rabbanim were not mevatel at the Reisakim. They just said that the Kenyans held in abeyance, and you can be chayzer, whatever, until there's a Mashiach. And he suggested that the Rambam means that once there is a Mashiach, the Kenyan is a mafreya. So therefore you understand, that's why the Kohen who does the Kenyan Kesef gives the moles, he sells his polo to the Israel, cannot feed it with truma, because if there's going to be Mashiach, it's a problem of feeding a behemoth zar. Now let's continue. A very interesting line here in the Rambam. V'ulam shar haponim shekonim ben hakakoyos v'zulosam kagon shtar v'chazoka. In a some choisel m'ksuvim gamke. So let's just start slowly. So he left that key in Kesef. It's like he jumped from talking about Mos and Metaltalin, and then he talks about Shtar and Chazaka and Kalka. So maybe the pshat is that what he's coming to do is telling you that there are two new kinyanim in Kalka, which are not in Metaltalin, but the kinyan, which is in Metaltalin, applies to Kalka. Ulam shar upon them, shar drochim shekoyim ben hakakoy zulosam to go in shtar v'chazaka and some psukim. But what about Kesef? Kesef, we know already. If you're ready to do that, which I'm not sure you should, but the other hand, I don't know exactly how to interpret the Rambam otherwise. Then l'chera, what the Rambam is saying, he's relying on what he said before, that minater mos konos to Rabbi Yochanan, and in Karka, he's saying you have two kinyonim besides the kinyan metaltalin. So this is very odd because Chazal always say when they talk about kinyan metaltalin, they call it moles. And when it talks about Karka, they call it kesef. In fact, everyone normally talk about this, but this thing you can run back and forth. I didn't hear many people speak about. But everyone knows the Choshen Mishpat and Simon Sadi, Sman, Taz, they disagree whether kesef, kinyan kesef, bekalka is a ma'aseh kinyan like shtar and chazaka, or it's kesef piroin. If you say and the assumption is that metaltalin, it's certainly kesef piroin. That's why it's called moles. So if you're ready to accept, then Karka is kesef piron, so then you might understand what the Ram is trying to do. And says that the kinyan of metaltalin applies to Karka also. But I wouldn't base that much on that. Because the Pasha, the Gemara, that you derive kinyan kesef from Kedushin, from Kesef and Karka, it's very difficult to assume the Kesef of Kedushin is Kesef Piroin. And most kindness is Piron Tashmi and Tashlumi Erechach. That's the value of the economy. Kesef is symbolic, it's a ma'aseh kinyan, and nothing to do with value. Because what's the kinyan? The kinyan is only because it's kifas milva that you owe the money, and you actually paid off, or there's a ma'aseh kinyan or a pruta. All the raid that they talk about yeshivas. Can't say much into it. I don't know that much about it. But the these lines in Rambam, it revolves about how to interpret these lines. Now, here's a very, very important just interpretation over here. He says, "Avoshah drochim shbehen niktas hakol kalkoyos mizulos koy mishtav chazocho va hismichu gam oisom lipsukim." And even Tibin, that was kapach samchu oisom lipsukim. So the best this can be, in my opinion, I'm not sure. I would assume that he doesn't mean an asmachta, but it could be the basis of a pirush makubal. Now you have to go look at the Sin Kedushin and Chavav and ask yourself a question. Okay, so the best you have over here is a pirush makubal. The best you have is a Pirush Makubal. So you ask yourself, why am I so concerned about this? So what difference does it make? It's a Pirush Makubal, not a Pirush Makubal. Okay. So no. So it's a Pirush Makubal. You have Sherish Bays. So if you recall that we said that the basis of a Shirano is the fact that the psukim in Torah Shebiksav. And we suggested that if it's not the Pshuta Shomikra in Torah Shebiksav, Toch HaKosuv, or Pirush HaKosuv, that the Pasuk clearly talks about it, as the Ram seems to say in Mitzvas Adihei, so we say that it wouldn't be a Shran. That's what I suggest. And here, the Ram says that it's enough. So I would suggest over here the following. And we'll see this in other cases later. If you recall, and it's a different issue, but it's a similar type of thing. We mentioned the possibility. Briskelov seems to assume that's true in Hilchos Malchos Asuvos, that even though you cannot derive a mitzvah from Yud Gimel Mitzvah, Yibidish Shater Ditreshes Behen, but if you have a mitzvah, you might be able to expand the mitzvah through the Midas HaTorah. Similarly, but only as a simile or metaphor, that if you have a Shurana, which is based on pure, unadulterated Torah Shebiksav, if you want to extend it to include other things, maybe a Pirush Makubal is enough to extend the mitzvah. Because the mitzvah, the Ram says, is v'chisim kumem kol hamisecha. It's the kinyan metaltalin. And that kinyan metaltalin, we say, also applies to Kauka. The other two ways to Makabel Karkas, I would say, the Drush is do with the mitzvah. The Ram is quoting them in the mitzvah. So maybe you could extend the mitzvah to Darka Kni and Kalka through a Pirush Makubal. That is my suggestion. And Mitzvah Hashem next week, we'll try to understand what this mitzvah of Toiv and Nitan is, Reish Memvav, and try to attack and understand what Reidif is, what's going on. The Pasuk, so it's Kappa, the Gemara in the hedging quotes a different drasha. The Ram Pirush Mishnayos is like that. What's going on, and what is the mitzvah Reidif, and maybe Ramach. We'll see. Mitzvah Shem B'li Neder. Have a nice week. Good show.